When we feel threatened, we see connection. When this connection is inconsistent, we develop anxious attachment. When there's rejection, we develop avoidant attachment. This is not pathological. It's an inbuilt mechanism. It's normal, healthy, and it's about emotional regulation. Welcome to The Art of Therapy, Season 3, Episode 6, the next step in our journey, attachment theory.
It's good to be back here with you in our studio and just to look further at the art of therapy.
Yes.
Yeah. So just in our last episode, we really started to explore object relations theory and really understanding it a bit more. And we did drift a little bit off into attachment theory, but we'll come back to that just now. But what we just looked at object relations theory is just how important our initial caregiver relationship is, and how the nature and quality of that relationship, really how it shapes our view of ourselves and our view of other relationships as well.
Mm-hmm.
And when a therapist can understand that, and when they have a sense of that, they can really assist clients in working through experiences and really having corrective emotional experiences in therapy then.
Yeah, so much. You've noted some important parts, which is about these early interactions. And yes, the understanding with object relations is that these early bonds actually help shape the self and who we are. And that was really a remarkable development, understanding this. And we also explored how we tend to split good from bad in managing anxiety. And that begins really as an infant. It's a protective mechanism, an adaptive mechanism, a defense mechanism. And what I would just add to that is, you noted that drift, because what we began to explore was, in effect, with Donald Winnicott, that his notion of care, and specifically good enough care. And that what was amazing there was not that care be perfect from the caregiver, but that it be attenuated, that it be meaningful, adjusted, where caregiver is responsive with instinctual, active empathy, and adjusting, supporting meaningfully. And if that care is good enough care, it's going to enable the infant and to begin and a little bit older, but start moving from that relative dependency to a little bit more autonomy. I don't think we noted it, but also his work around transitional objects and how that enables the child to begin exploring more actively and more safely. So it was this remarkable work that he did around good enough care. And we began to drift there because, attachment theory is very, very close to object relations theory. And once the light was focused and it highlighted the importance of these early bonds and how that begins to shape us, but moreover, not just insight into it, but actually having a corrective emotional experience, as you noted, that really then showed the importance of these early bonds and would lead to all sorts of very exciting developments.
Mm-hmm. It really is an amazing theory, and it really it explains so much of human behavior.
Yes.
Yeah. So what if we really dive more into attachment theory then today, and that we just maybe start having a look at just how do they fit into each other, and then really understanding a bit more of attachment theory.
Yes. Okay, so really where attachment theory begins is around the 1950s into the 1980s, and now really in great utilization today in various ways. But really in the 1950s, it was John Bowlby a British psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, and of course influenced by the psychoanalytic inputs and aspects around object relations. And what he recognized was, okay, this notion of attachment for human beings is not secondary to anything else like feeding. It's not secondary to, say, drive reduction. It's a vital, essential mechanism that's independent in and of itself. So effectively, it's something that's wired into us. It's biological. And it's an adaptation mechanism that activates.
It just actually, it's there, it's for survival.
Yes, yeah, very much. And what he identified was that when we experience any kind of threat, it activates this adaptation system. And immediately, if we just look at a young baby, or that what happens then is that the baby then seeks proximity to a caregiver where there is safety. And the moment that caregiver is able to provide that support, that safety, and effectively be that safe haven, then that baby then just, that system downregulates, and they experience that attachment. One way of defining it is secure. And there are a whole lot of other developments that come from that, but just principally to understand that that creates that security, that safety, that safe haven. But he went further to indicate that from there, that infant or toddler begins to then utilize that relationship and that secure relationship as now a safe base from which to go and explore. And of course, explore with increasing autonomy. So that's part of what he identified. So that this is a system, a safety system, an adaptive system. And what happens when there's responsive caregiving. But what he then outlined was when there is this activation and the infant then seeks that proximity to the caregiver for protection and safety. If the caregiver isn't responsive, or that there is an inconsistency in that responsiveness, that's now going to have impact. And in effect, that attachment is going to become, would be defined as insecure. And the moment that becomes insecure, that system is going to react further. And there's going to be a hyperactivation of that system, which we'll explore, and then a deactivation. But the central thing here is that what he had explained was that attachment is adaptive. It's this biological mechanism, and it's there to help us with emotional regulation.
It's actually amazing to look at it like that. That an infant, it's really, we're born with it.
Yes.
It's just there and seeking that attachment. And when the response to that attachment depends then how we function. And we'll go into a bit more detail of it. But just human beings are actually amazing. And that we need those relationships, we need those attachments.
Yes.
And that it becomes part of our adaptive function.
Yeah. How you've understood, and just that's the key, that it's adaptive. And it is this remarkable built-in mechanism for our survival, for our safety. And when there's been some effects and impacts from the caregiving, and inconsistent or rejecting responses. We'll look at that. Yes, that's going to have a strong impact and serve something as a blueprint for how we enter adulthood and how we tend to emotionally regulate. But the key thing is it's adaptive. Yes, it's now being in adulthood being overused, and therefore it's no longer helpful. But it was once very adaptive and highly necessary. So yes, that it's biological, it's adaptive, and it doesn't in any way indicate a dysfunction or pathology. It indicates an adaptive response that's being overutilized or utilized in a way that's not helpful or needed.
Mm-hmm. It actually just depends on what is happening, but it's adaptive in that moment, and it helps with survival in that moment.
Yes.
Later on, it might not be helpful in a different relationship, but it's not, like you say, it's not pathology. It depends on the relationship and how it's utilized.
Yes. Yeah, the key is recognizing that it's how the individual is trying to emotionally regulate, how they're trying to manage a threat or emotional regulation within that relationship or with that connection.
Mm-hmm. It really is. It's how they manage their emotional regulation.
Yes.
And that is what children need.
Very much. Yeah, often it's looked at in terms of types, and I think that's it's understandable, but it's really about emotional regulation. But let's just look more fundamentally at some of the work that would then build on Bowlby, and it was one of his associates or former students, Mary Ainsworth, who now began to empirically test this and give expression to it. And she had these amazing, something of an experimental procedure, the strange situation procedure, where she would really now observe children of 12 to 18 months, so 1 to 1.5 years old, and then have a situation where they observed, where first they're having contact with a parent or caregiver, and exploring. Then a stranger's introduced, and then there's a separation, then there's a reunion, a separation, reunion. And what she was beginning to do is look at how the child responds to this. And it was from this procedure that she began to recognize, really she identified 3 particular patterns, but a 4th would be developed later. But the first pattern was this secure attachment, where there's a separation, the child, there is some distress, but when the caregiver is back, they're pacified, they receive that support, and then they begin exploring again. And this was identified as secure. And what it related to was what was in common with that child and the parent, the profile or the pattern, was a kind of parenting that's very consistent, where the support, the responsiveness is consistent. And so the child becomes really secure. And in that context, the child also internalizes a working model for both how they see themselves and how they see others, which is, am I worthy of care? Yes, I'm worthy, and that sense of self-worth. And then, are others reliable, responsive? Yes, that's my experience. Others are responsive, reliable. Mm-hmm. And that really is secure attachment. Mm-hmm. We'll explore a little bit more a bit further on. But just then looking at the next style that emerged, what she identified was the avoidance style. An avoidant attachment style, where when the caregiver left, there was very little distress observed. And when the caregiver returned, there was really a distance, a rejecting, ignoring. So not receiving that that a caregiver. And so it really was defined then as avoidant and an avoidant attachment style, where what that relates to is care or supposed care, where when the child was really being vulnerable, the caregiving really did not come in closely in an attuned way, in a responsive way. And so what actually begins to happen there is the child now begins to downregulate, which is in effect, I can't afford to be vulnerable. I can't afford to need this relationship. So I've got to be really on my own. And so that's a way of coping, hence the avoidant attachment style, where there's an experience repeatedly of disappointment or rejection or lack of responsive caregiving.
Psychotherapy is not only a profession, it's a state of being. And for that, it requires continuous learning, training, and refining your skills. If you would like to become better in your role as a psychotherapist, come and join Dr. Warwick Phipps for in-person training at Treatment Work Centre, where you will experience training like never before from a thought leader and expert in psychotherapy. If you would like some more information on our training or to book a training session, please visit the link in the description. And also, if you find these podcast episodes meaningful, please subscribe to The Art of Therapy. And it's to actually maintain that attachment. It's for the survival of it, so it's adaptive functioning.
Exactly. Yes, very much. That's why it's actually considered organized, because it's adaptive.
Yes.
Then the third one that you identified was where the parent left, the child would become very, very distressed. The parent or caregiver would return, and the child would struggle to be pacified and would protest, often clingy and at the same time angry. And she identified this style as the ambivalent style. Effectively, others have since developed on it a resistant or anxious attachment style, because what is occurring there is on separation and return, there is a mixed response. Both the initial clingy, so seeking proximity, but then not being pacified, and the anger. So it's a mixed response. And so interestingly, what the infant is doing there is actually not deactivating, but hyperactivating, where escalating is a way of maintaining that connection. So it's as if there that the infant is saying, I can't afford to lose the connection, and has adjusted by increasing and escalating. But it's associated with then that anxiety, that resistance, that ambivalent attachment.
Mm-hmm. Wanting that proximity, but also being angry in that proximity.
Yes. So that was the third style. And a fourth style was then identified, which was really initially identified as a disorganized style. And what that presented with was where the parent or the caregiver separates but returns. And on return, there's both proximity and avoidance by the child, a very confusing response, and one that was often associated with fear or just helplessness or just confusion, literally just immobilized. So it was really called a disorganized, and later others had called it disorientated. The child is really confused, often immobilized. And what this was associated with in terms of caregiving was where there'd been trauma in the caregiving relationship, or very, very extreme rejection or unresolved loss. Any kind of trauma, unresolved loss, extreme rejection, was then the child would develop this disorganized attachment style, which was considered really serious.
Really having a child having difficulty because the caregiver is simultaneously both in the supporting role and the fear role, and that creates massive confusion then.
Yeah, exactly. Because in that instance, the child is having to depend on someone that hurts him or that they are deeply fearful of for safety. So trying to lean on someone for safety, but the same person is having a very distressing effect. Yeah. So it literally becomes immobilizing. Yeah. And the child is literally then, through this, beginning to express, I can't afford to, or I can't do this safely. I can't find safety safely. Yeah, and it's immobilized.
They're stuck.
Yeah, stuck. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, to listen to these different attachment styles, it really it creates so much sense in how people relate. And once we can understand it, you can understand how come it was adaptive, how come it was needed.
Yes.
And then when it's there, then you can start to have a look. Okay, but how did it shape? How did it create that understanding? And how do people then attach to in their current relationships?
Yes, that's the thing. It occurs so early in life, and it's a form of emotional regulation. But of course, if that's what's learned and been acquired, it's going to be a preferred way or a very dominant learned way of regulating. So, of course, yes, the adult or that child takes it into adulthood very often in terms of intimate relationship, friendships, work relationships, even therapeutic relationships. It's actually expressed there. But the key here is recognizing that it's not so much type, that it's really all about emotional regulation.
That's the function of it. It just helps to emotionally regulate.
Yes. Yeah. That's the key. And that's why really when one starts to look at how is this expressed in adulthood, there are two key dimensions that have been considered, that attachment anxiety, where really what's happening there is the adult within a relationship or interaction where there's some perception of threat to that connection. And so really what happens to the nervous system of that individual is there's actually the hyperactivation, which is considerably stressful. It's effectively setting up the system for fight, flight, freeze. Yeah. And that's kind of proximity seeking in the adult. And adults can be texting actively, that intense emotional closeness that occurs, or can be that close involvement, sometimes being clingy. So that's really what's going on.
It's actually that activation that's just happening to help to emotionally regulate.
Yeah, indeed. And then there's the other dimension, which is attachment avoidance. And here, the individual has learned to manage threats to connection, threats to relationship, through down-regulating, by avoiding closer relationships, emotionally close, more intimate, by being more independent, more autonomous, intellectualizing things, holding that emotional distance. And so it's associated with less anxiety, but increased avoidance.
I think it's beautiful to understand it in adulthood and how people then it utilizes that to help them to emotionally regulate.
Yes.
And it just shows again, there's not pathology around that. It's just adaptive functioning.
Yes.
And does that work in a certain relationship or not?
Exactly. And once one recognizes it, then of course, because it's not dysfunction or it's not a flaw or anything like that, it's just a form of overly utilized emotional regulation. But there's other ways. And so immediately for the therapist can begin to consider how to manage this, how to support the client. And really what we understand now is a key part of this work and treatment bring healing is helping the client to have an emotional corrective experience. And this was really part of the big move. We saw it in object relations, beginning to recognize that insight is important, but there's also something important about the nature and quality of relationships and the therapeutic relationship. Call it transference and bring that into the here and now. But increasingly in attachment theory, we see the goal here of the therapeutic relation, one of the goals, is to create the safe haven and the secure base. That secure base to go and to assist the client to explore painful, distressing emotions and experiences, to go and do that. And when overly stressed, overwhelmed, to be the safe haven. And that helps and already begins to bring about that corrective emotional experience. Now the client is learning to associate proximity in a new way. And with that proximity, there can be that increased comfort, which is safety, but it can also mean increased exploration, increased autonomy. But that too is not threatening. So there's a corrective emotional experience that begins to take place.
It's beautiful because it happens in the relationship with the therapist.
It does. That's the thing. And what starts to happen is, of course, is this is part of another aspect of the therapy. There's this co-regulation. So as the therapist is being really present and creating this presence, this safety, this safe haven, the secure base, the client will literally experience an automatic change in their own neurological. Effectively, they will down-regulate, will actually auto-regulate.
And that's how they learn, different ways.
Yeah, they're literally learning they're having a different experience. It's no longer hyperactivation, or deactivation. They're having a different experience. They literally, their autonomic system begins to balance. There's more relaxation, and there's a whole new emotional regulation that's occurring there as part of that corrective emotional experience.
The more you talk about it, the more the word it's the art of therapy that just comes up for me, because this is it.
Yes.
This is aspects of the art of therapy and understanding this.
Yes, very much. It is the art of therapy, because the therapist is now moving from any kind of type, but really beginning to understand what is that emotional regulation serve in the here and now, and how can I assist them to make a change in the here and now, that corrective emotional experience, and a change in the regulation through co-regulation. The other thing that I would add is, yes, part of attachment theory is very often working and introducing mentalisation, so helping the client beginning to understand their own mental state, but also beginning to understand the mental state of another. The moment one can understand one's own mental state, it's far less threatening. One can begin to understand that relation, the interaction. But when you begin to understand safely the mental state of another, that also begins to reduce threat and change the way one is trying to emotionally regulate. So these are just some of the ways, and I think it's a really smart idea then, and an introduction that we see in attachment theory, is this notion of rupture and repair. A little bit of this began with Donald Winnicott when he was saying, object relation, not about perfect. It's about good enough care. He was talking about the good enough mother, but we understand now it's good enough care. It didn't need to be perfect. And yes, with attachment theory, the understanding, we realize now that it's not through a perfect relationship. It's a relationship where there can be misunderstanding, there can be disappointment, there can be a little more distance, a little more closeness. But when there's a so-called rupture, is there repair? And how does that get worked out? What happens to the client? Can they work it out safely? And that can mean in a therapeutic or any relation, but let's just take a therapeutic, that they can reach out for support in a vulnerable way that's appropriate. And that's met in some appropriate professional way. Or they can withdraw, and with a therapist or someone actually just exploring that in a more curious way, no judgment. Because remember that avoidance response, the distance, the intellectualization, whatever it is, had served a function. It's adaptive. So just curiously exploring that, which brings it into a client's awareness. And the moment one can do and experience this, it's happening within the therapeutic relationship.
It's absolutely beautiful to hear it like this, because there's so much power in the here and now, and working things out and having different experiences.
Yes. It really is all about the here and now. Even when we're reflecting on and understanding the there and then, as we understand that, it assumes a really important part of someone's experience and how we understand their experience. And it's how it is being expressed in the here and now. What's happening at this very moment, therapeutically or in one of their primary relationships. And attachment theory really shows us what is happening in terms of that early caregiving, and how we utilize a built-in biological mechanism, an adaptive mechanism for emotional regulation, and how we can expand it and adjust that.
Where it's needed and where it works in different ways.
Yes.
My sense is that we can literally spend hours on this and just exploring it further and further. But it creates, what we looked at, it creates so much meaning, and it is the art of therapy, and it makes it exciting, and there's so much opportunity for healing and for changing just the things and the experiences.
Very much. And what I think is part of that meaning, and what makes it so exciting, is that in psychotherapy we see that every development contributes and adds to the next. We know that human beings are incredibly unique, adaptive, exquisitely creative. And so each time there's a development, we get to add a lens or have a nuance. And while we see with attachment theory its place in understanding the way we interact from a very early age around our attachments, and how we develop self-regulation, that emotional regulation, but how we can expand that and change that in the here and now in really clear ways therapeutically, which can mean for very profound therapeutic work and remarkable resolution and relief.
It really is. It's powerful.
Yes.
Yeah, I think if we maybe just pause here for today, just on attachment theory, and I think we've really looked at this, and it's so meaningful and it's so empowering to be able to understand this and understand the adaptive attachment styles.
Yes.
So, but I do think that there's so many other developments. Like you say, human nature, it's so complex. And there's a range of other ones that we also still have to look at.
Yes.
So maybe if we pause here today and then we can look at another theory the next time.
I go with that. Of course, with the movement here in attachment therapy, really looking closely at behavior and doing so empirically, what it highlighted was, wow, if there are these kinds of interactions and we look at behavior in this way, is there more that we can discover? And of course there is.
Yes.
So, yes, let's explore this the next episode. And I think we both know this is looking at this remarkable development, the behavioral approach, behaviorism. Wow, what a development.
Yes.
But let's pause here for today.
Okay, let's do that. Thank you for joining us on The Art of Therapy. If you found this episode meaningful, or if it expanded your knowledge, we would love to hear from you in the comments section. We are looking forward to continuing this journey with you. Until our next episode.